still missing two people's full data, so I have partial data from everybody, but I don't have complete data from everybody. I've sent emails to those of you who do not have full data to me yet. I need those because tomorrow we're supposed to analyze those data, so check your email and make sure you've sent me what I need. I am checking my script with the partial data set that I have just to make sure that it runs, but before I can finish everything. The other thing is, Luke, I think you may have flipped where you put some of your data, your disk data, because your totals for pencil search are higher than your totals for finger search with sandpaper. So go back and check your data sheet and make sure that you put those two in the same, in the right place.
I'll check.
I don't know that you did or didn't. It would just be unusual for you to have more disk captured using a pencil than with your finger. So it's just, as I go through and look at people's data, I'm like, that doesn't look right. That was one of the things that appeared a little off. I thought I had videoed last Friday, but evidently when I got home actually later that day, I checked my iPad and there was a video on there. So I'm not sure what happened there, but I just checked today and it is recording. So get notes from friends and come see me if you have any questions about anything. That said, do you have any questions from last week? All right, we're continuing to talk about economic decisions. In the Lima and Dill article that we read to talk about writing in lab, we talked about economic decisions where risk of predation is concerned. So let's just review that information. In that paper, they talked a lot about foraging decisions made under risk of predation, and a lot of the economic decisions that we've been talking about so far in this chapter have been foraging related decisions, because foraging is how one goes about getting energy. So think back to the Lima and Dill paper. What were some of the strategies that organisms will do, will adopt when faced with a risk of predation? This was 3 weeks ago that we read the paper.
They'll sacrifice like the amount of energy they can get to go at a less dangerous pace.
Okay, so if we go back to something like the ideal free distribution kind of scenario, where we have fish in a tank, we divide that tank in half, we have food that is being dribbled into the tank at one rate, and another side, the food is dribbling in at half the rate. So this is basically 1 times food, 2 times food. Generally, what we would expect to see if we were to put 12 fish into this scenario, we would expect to find 8 of the fish over here, 4 of the fish over here, because you should have twice as many fish where there's twice as much food. Therefore, everybody in the tank is getting the same rate of energy gain. And so this would be making the assumption that the currency that is being maximized is energy gain per unit time. Are the same 4 and 8 fish going to be on both sides of the tank every time you go and look at the tank? No, they can move back and forth, but if one individual moves to this side of the tank, then that reduces the net rate of energy gain, and so either that individual will figure out that was a mistake and go back to the other side, or one of the ones that was already there will experience the decline in energy gain and move back to the other tank, so that if you go and look at the tank, every 5 minutes for an hour, you should see on average that there should be on average 4 over here and on average 8 over here. Now, the things that has been done in these types of experiments is you can put a permeable screen in there that has holes in it that are big enough to allow the fish that you're studying to go through, but small enough that if you put a predatory fish on one side of the tank, it represents either a real threat or in some cases you can simulate the threat. So it's a non-lethal threat by putting this individual in a jar inside that tank. It's visible to the fish, but the fish don't actually get killed and eaten by it. Or you can just leave it in there free living. What will happen when you do that generally is you get fewer fish on this side of the tank. You will get something like 9 and 3 because fish are avoiding that patch because there's a predatory threat there. And as a result, they basically say, we're going to take way less energy gain per unit time because there is a real or perceived threat on the side of the tank that has the richer patch of food. Then what researchers do is they alter the output here until there's enough energy coming out of this side. So now there's 5 times more energy entering this patch over here, that finally you get back to this distribution. And then what you've essentially done is you have quantified the energetic equivalent of the risk of predation. Basically, how much more energy do you need to be coaxed over to the dangerous side of the tank? So now we can place the risk of predation in the same currency as the currency of foraging by conducting an experiment, because we know what the energy gains are at this rate of feeding, and now we know what the energy gains would be at this higher rate of feeding, and it's those energy gains that are necessary to convince fish to take on a larger level of risk. And this is an important breakthrough because one of the problems with dealing with the risk of predation is that it's in a different unit of measure. It's death versus living. It's a 0-1 kind of outcome, but by creating an artificial environment where you can basically alter the net rate of energy that is found in different patches, you can essentially say how big is this predatory threat in terms of the amount of energy gain that is needed to overcome that threat. And there was a series of experiments that have attempted to do this kind of thing. Yeah.
This concept, is that to the point where the fish return to their original distribution?
Yep. It's when it's how much food you have to be over here to go back to the ideal free distribution. Presumably, this is now measuring the net rate of energy gain on this side. This is also measuring the net rate of energy gain, though it has to be bigger in order for individuals to go over there and accept the greater level of risk. And so whatever the difference is between the amount of energy that was needed to have an ideal free distribution early on versus whatever the difference is in terms of this rate of feeding, this is the energetic equivalent of predation risk, whatever that ends up being. So how much energy is an individual prepared to part with in order to stay alive is another way of thinking of it.
What is EUPR?
Energetic equivalent of predation risk. What other kinds of decisions do individuals make under the risk of predation that would fall into this economic framework of thinking?
Foraging closer to home.
Okay, so foraging closer to home, you could, this once again has also been done in various forms at various times. You have squirrels that live on a tree, and you can basically take little dishes and you can put some food in it, like peanuts or something that is easily quantifiable in terms of total mass, which is also equivalent to total energy. And if you put those dishes really close to the tree, you will find that it doesn't take much food in order to get them to come down, take the peanuts out of the dish and run back up their tree. Presumably their tree is where they have safe shelter from predators. If you take the same amount of peanuts though and put them further away, the animal is less likely to go and get those peanuts. And as you increase the distance of the food reward from the tree, if this animal is perceiving distance from the tree as proportional to predation risk, you should expect the frequency of visits to these things to be lower as you get further and further away. You can quantify this risk once again by basically asking if this is 1 foot or 1 meter from the tree and this is 10 meters from the tree, how many more peanuts do I need to put in that 10 meter away dish in order to get the same rate of visitation as you get from a dish that is 1 meter away? Well, once again, whatever that difference is, that's how the organism is perceiving what the energetic risk of predation is. And so I'm not going to go and get that 10 meter away dish. I'm not going to take advantage of that patch of food unless it's really worth my while going out and getting it. And so whatever the difference is between the energy in the 10 meter dish versus the energy in the 1 meter dish, that's basically this difference tells you something very quantifiable about how individuals are perceiving risk. So distance from safe shelter is one of the things that came up in that article. What other kinds of things?
Time of day.
Oh, time of day. Are any of you bird watchers? If you go bird watching, do any of you know any bird watchers? Who do you know, Logan?
My grandma's a bird watcher.
Oh, what does she do when she goes bird watching?
Are you guys like where she goes or?
I'm asking when she goes.
Mornings?
Oh my God. So if you ever go out and are doing a biodiversity survey where your goal is to measure the biodiversity of a particular area, like a national park or something like this, they have these programs called rapid assessment teams. It's where ornithologists and herpetologists and entomologists and botanists and everything are on a team, and you go to a place in a part of the world where biodiversity is not very well quantified, and your goal is to count as many species, to survey as many species of your particular taxonomic group as you can in the time that you have available, which is usually 2 to 3 weeks. So you all go out there. There's a beetle guy who's collecting dung beetles, so he's actually going around collecting human feces to put out in the forest so that they will be visited by dung beetles. There are butterfly people who are going around the forest during the daytime, catching butterflies that are flying through the forest. There are bird people who are waking up really, really, really early in the morning, going out and looking for birds because that's when birds are most active. And you have the amphibian reptile people who are staying out really, really late at night because that's when a lot of frogs and snakes and stuff are active. So you want to be out there where they're active. What starts to cause conflict on the team is when the bird people wake up really early and wake up the herpetologists who just went to bed, and the herpetologists come in at 3 in the morning from doing their sampling, and they're loud when they're getting themselves ready for bed, and they wake up the bird people who want to squeeze in another hour or 2 of sleep before they wake up at 5. And the reason reason for this is that birds are most active early in the morning. One of the explanations for this is that that's when you're safest, at dusk and around dusk, where organisms that can see well at night aren't doing as well at dusk, and organisms that see well during the day are also not doing very well at dusk. And so this crepuscular time period, these fancy scientific the fancy scientific term for organisms that are active at dawn and dusk is crepuscular. So birds are crepuscular. They reach a peak of activity typically at around dawn, and they reach a peak of activity at around sunset. So if you're crepuscular, one of the reasons you may be crepuscular is actually because it makes you harder to detect. Now, if all the birds in the forest are adopting this crepuscular approach, what does that mean for things like competition for food? There's a lot of competition because everybody is out and active. And so you might actually be active at a time of day that actually influences what your net rate of energy gain is, because while you're avoiding predators, you're out there when all the other birds are active, and as a result, you are experiencing lower net energy gain than you would if you were active at a different time. But at that different time, you have less competition, but you have higher risk of predation. So time of day, how far away from shelter you are, which patches you forage in terms of how rich those patches are. You might choose to forage in a lower quality patch because that patch also is associated with less predation. What other things were mentioned in that really long paper that you guys read?
Resumption of feeding after interruption.
Oh yeah, so there's all kinds of interesting experiments. An experiment done in the desert southwest of Coronado Range. These guys were looking at the surface activity of kangaroo rats. Kangaroo rats are a nocturnal mammal species, and they tend to get preyed upon by owls, and so they created these large fenced-in enclosures to study the activity and the foraging behavior of kangaroo rats. And after they kind of quantified what kangaroo rats do in these fenced-in enclosures under normal conditions, they then rigged up a zip line that went across these pins that these kangaroo rats lived in, and they would basically tie a stuffed owl specimen with wings outstretched on the zip line, and they would just zip the owl across it at set times, and then they would look at what the kangaroo rats did when a taxidermied owl went flying over their enclosure. They all ran for their burrows, and they could look at how much time it took for them to come back out and resume normal activities after this perceived threat. So once again, if you're hiding in your burrow, you're not out there actively foraging, and so once again, the longer you stay in your burrow, the longer you're giving up on energy gain, so your overall rate of energy gain is lower. These things should not come as a shock to you at this point. It's a perfectly reasonable sort of response. Once again, the stuffed owl in this case is the same as a fish in a jar in an aquarium. It's not a real threat, it's a perceived threat, but oftentimes that perceived threat is enough to get a response out of it. What about mating? Think of an organism that you've seen doing things related to mating. Activities related to mating. What's that?
Dung flies.
Oh, dung flies. Okay, so dung flies, we've talked about dung flies from the perspective of copulation duration, but one of the challenges with a dung fly is that when you are a male dung fly mating with a female dung fly, you're connected to her. Neither of you can fly particularly well when you're in that position, and as a result, any time that you spend copulating is a time when you're at greater risk of predation. So we can think of dung fly mating and duration of copulation as just simply being about the economics of how many sperm the male transmits to the female, but you might also find, once again, lack of quantitative match of dung fly mating behavior, lack of quantitative match to what's predicted by the model, while there's good qualitative match, because maybe not the only thing going through a dung fly's mind is how many sperm he transmits, but also how many sperm he transmits while also balancing the risk of predation. So you might stop copulating with the female earlier than a model might predict if you have two different demands that you're trying to satisfy. One demand, successful reproduction, the other demand, surviving to reproduce another day. I think I've already mentioned this term that's common in behavioral ecology. All of these cases that we're thinking of are examples of individuals that are balancing conflicting demands. In terms of foraging decisions, balancing the demand of meeting your metabolic needs versus the demand of staying alive to forage another day. In the case of mating in dung flies, staying in copula with a female long enough to get enough sperm transferred, balanced against the fact that while you're in copula, you are less likely, or you're more likely rather to be preyed upon because you have reduced escape ability. What other organisms can you think of their mating behavior? Not necessarily something we mentioned in class so far, just something you know from your own experience.
Don't cats get like linked together like that?
Well, cats do, so do dogs, but they're not used domesticated organisms.
Wild jungle cats.
Sure, wild jungle cats. Sure.
Yes.
Anything that forces you to be physically coupled to another individual is going to probably increase your odds of being preyed upon because you lack the ability to escape it.
Doesn't mating in general just increase your predation risk?
Yeah, sure. There are times though when it doesn't necessarily have to, but in many cases it does. Sponges don't increase their predation risk when they go to mate because they just distribute sperm and egg out into the ocean and it just floats away. And they're sessile creatures anyway, so their risk of predation is relatively constant all the time because they're attached to one space. The act of reproducing doesn't change that equation at all. Rabbits. Why would rabbits not experience higher risk of predation?
Oh, you just asked us any other example.
Oh, any other example? Oh, of an organism. So what do you know about rabbit mating behavior? Because I know practically nothing about rabbit mating behavior.
They do it a lot.
Or they
That's
do it,
quick.
or they do it once and they reproduce a lot of offspring as a result of it.
There's some sort of study about rabbits.
Yeah.
Reproducing like rabbits,
Yeah.
that could mean that rabbits are getting lucky on a frequent basis, or they get lucky once and produce a lot of babies. This is the problem with commonplace sayings sometimes, is they don't necessarily reflect the actual biology. What we know is rabbits usually have relatively large litters, but that large litter might actually just come from one copulatory event. Now I've gotten you guys very comfortable about talking about sex because we've used all the sciencey terms. I don't know about rabbit mating rituals.
Jungle cats really aren't at a risk for predation because what's gonna eat them?
Another jungle cat.
Shit.
And I'm not sure what you're talking about, a jungle cat. You're like talking about a jaguar?
Panthers, cougars, jaguars, lions, cheetahs, like what eats those?
Okay, so,
We do.
humans will certainly kill them. Now, I don't know whether they would eat them or not, but certainly they
But
would kill them.
do you think that their thought process when they mate is what's gonna eat me?
So when you think about lions compete with hyenas for food, and so hyenas and lions are constantly kind of at war with one another over territory and things like this. So once again, the act of copulating, if it takes you away from guarding your territory, the territory of your pride of lions, that might have a negative effect on your general well-being. So while you might not have a risk of predation, you might risk losing territory. Yes?
Maybe like when birds do their dumb dances.
Oh my gosh, the
More
dumb
visible.
dances of birds. Look up a widow bird, the African widow bird. Tell me what sticks out at you first when you see a widow bird. Super long tail. Can you get video of a widow bird flying? So that's a male-male competition, males competing with one another for access to females. They suck at flying, don't they? If you're a bird, one of the great advantages of being a bird is you can just fly away from potential predators. But when you're saddled with this really, really long tail, it reduces your ability to fly. How many of you have ever seen a peacock fly? I've seen them fly. Once
Yeah,
again,
they fly.
they're not particularly good at it. They can do it, they're just not particularly good at it. What's that?
Oh, I was just saying, I've seen them fly.
Yeah, I've seen them fly.
It's a crap, like a turkey kind of.
Yeah, they're way less good at
Yeah.
flying than turkeys are.
Turkeys are not bad.
A guy that I knew in graduate school, one of our professors, he had a series of peacocks, and they could pretty much fly up onto the house and back down to the ground from the house, but that was about the extent of their flight. When you're saddled with this long tail, it reduces your ability to fly effectively. So what on earth would be happening in the environment to essentially over the course of evolutionary time for these birds to have these ridiculously long tails? And by the way, I've seen peacocks in the wild in their native range, and they also have really long tails. That's not something humans did to them.
The ladies dig it.
The ladies dig it. Long tails are sexy. If you take a widow bird and you clip its tail, its mating success goes down, even though its ability to survive predation attacks may go up. If you take a widow bird with an average sized tail and attach extensions to the tail, all of a sudden the ladies think that that male is much more sexy than it was. So this is a case where sexual selection is important. Sexual selection is selection that is exerted by one member of a species against other members of the species when the two different members of the species are male and female. And so in this case, males prefer long tail length, and as a result,
Females prefer or males prefer?
I'm sorry, did I say males?
You
Sorry,
said-
females prefer long tail length, and as a result of this choice made by females, those males that have long tails have better reproductive success, and their offspring will have better reproductive success because male offspring of long-tailed males inherit the long tail, and then you get into this escalating runaway selection. It's kind of like a predator-prey arms race, except in this case it's an arms race that is driven by sexual selection. Females like males with longer tails. Longer-tailed males get more matings. Also, because the offspring of that coupling, where the female was choosy and the male had the exaggerated male trait, their offspring that are males will have longer tails, but their offspring who are female will also have this female choice. And so over time, female choice gets stronger and stronger, male tails get longer and longer, which is then where you get things like peacocks and widow birds. That, once again, is balancing one demand, which is successful reproduction, against another demand, which is surviving to make it to the next day.
They call them widow birds because the males don't survive as long.
I don't know why they're called widow birds. That would be interesting to find out. I've never thought about that. Good observation, perhaps. Yes, birds and their ridiculous dances. What are they also doing while they're dancing? They're also calling. They're also making a lot of noise. So you have big flashy feathers and you're making a lot of noise. What are you basically transmitting to predators? Come kill me and eat me. Who else vocalizes to attract mates out there in the animal world? It's gonna start happening here in about a month. Frogs do this all the time. They aggregate in large aggregations in some cases, and all of the males are calling so that they produce enough noise that females at a great distance can hear them. The females hop towards the males calling. Once they're there, they mate with one another. The specifics of mating vary a lot from species to species, but a frog chorus is once again just a bunch of animals who are trying to gain the attention of the opposite sex, but in the process of gaining the attention of the opposite sex, they're also gaining the attention of everybody else. There are a series of bats in Central America that are frog-eating bats. These frog-eating bats feed on a group of frogs in the genus Physalimmus. The Tongara frog, Physalimmus pustulosus, and they locate and find bats and are capable of catching bats. The bats are capable of finding frogs, locating frogs, picking frogs off the surface of the water based on nothing more than receiving their call. And so they echolocate on the frog call in the same way that other bats would echolocate on a flying insect. And they swoop down and they pick them up off the surface of the water and they fly off and eat them. Risk of predation. It's a real thing. Frog is in the water calling. As it calls, it's expending energy. You can actually put a frog in a metabolic chamber, hook it up to a light core machine that we have upstairs. You can measure its metabolic rate while it's at rest. You can measure its metabolic rate while it's calling. You would be amazed at how much energy frogs spend calling. And so one of the costs of reproduction for frogs is the amount of energy that is needed to call. And they are expending that energy, which is costly to them, at the same time that they're putting themselves at higher risk of predation. Those two things basically demonstrate how important reproduction is as a driver in the behavior of organisms. Have I thoroughly beaten risk of predation to death? Okay, let's move on. Learning. Learning is important because sometimes you have to learn how to handle a particular prey item. Sometimes you have to learn where to find food. And so learning is a component of behavior that has been studied at it's been studied at length in behavioral ecology. So sticklebacks, there are different species of sticklebacks. This is a small fish. It's a well-known fish because it has armor. It has bony plates around its body that are presumably for defense. They have really sharp spines, once again, also for defense. But they vary from species to species, and they even vary within species in terms of how bony and how spiny they are. And what people have found is that individuals or species with weaker defenses will use social learning to learn about feeding rates in different patches more than species with stronger defenses. And so some species that are heavily armored, they'll go and they will seek out information about the quality of different patches on their own, while weaker species will hang out, they'll watch other individuals forage before they go and decide where they're going to forage. And so this social learning occurs in that way. Another way of social learning is copying. You see an individual doing one thing, and then you copy that behavior because it seems to be working for the other individual. This is probably what happened originally with termite fishing in chimpanzees. This is something that was reported back in the 1960s by Jane Goodall and her colleagues. Are you guys familiar with this behavior?
The stick in the log.
The stick in the termite mound. Yep. So one chimp stuck a stick in a termite mound, pulled it out, and there were a bunch of termites on it. Ate the termites off of the stick, and before you know it, all the members of that individual's clan were doing it. And this is a behavior that has spread through a small section of Africa through cultural transmission of knowledge among chimpanzees, such that there's a small geographic area of Africa where chimpanzees do this behavior and no other chimpanzees around Africa engage in this behavior because they just haven't stumbled upon it yet. And as a result, nobody's gotten anything out of it and nobody has copied it. So it leads to the development of local traditions. You can also have situations where individuals learn through formal teaching. This is something that happens in meerkats, where meerkats, which people love primarily because they're cute and they have their own television program for a while. Meerkats eat scorpions. One of the things about a scorpion is that scorpions sting. While most scorpions are not deadly, it certainly hurts. I've been stung by a scorpion on the thumb before. It was not life-threatening, but it also wasn't very pleasant. And so meerkats learn to eat scorpions from, once again, being formally taught by the adults. The adults will bring baby meerkats a dead scorpion, feed the baby meerkats a dead scorpion, and then after the baby meerkats are used to eating dead scorpions, they will bring them a scorpion that the adult has bitten the tail off of and let them handle scorpions without a stinger, and they will eventually work up to fully intact scorpions that are capable of stinging that the adults will bring them, so that they over time learn how to handle. And when you see meerkats handle a scorpion, you'll almost always see them try to bite the tail off of the scorpion first. This is also something that happens with hedgehogs that also occur in Africa. We had a bunch of hedgehogs at the University of Texas at Arlington, mainly because Butch Brody thought they were cute. And he got the idea that we should feed them some clay models of scorpions. I worked in a lab where we did a lot of scorpion and spider research, and so he talked. My major professor was actually one of Brody's former students, and so there was a lot of inter-lab interaction. And he's like, I wonder if hedgehogs who are in the presence of scorpions have evolved any stereotypical ways of handling scorpions. And so we made little clay models of scorpions and then set them down in the hedgehog's cage. And then the hedgehog came out, they saw the scorpion, they looked at the scorpion, and the first thing that they did was they bit the tail off. And then they figured out that it wasn't a real scorpion, it was just a clay model, and they're like, okay, that's not much fun. So I'll stop mulling it. But it was once again this very hardwired sort of response, because those guys had lived in the lab for a really long time. No idea what their experience in nature was prior to landing in our lab, but they definitely got this behavior somewhere. In the case of meerkats, they actually go through formal teaching. So let's talk about some of these things. So when we think about sticklebacks, going back to sticklebacks, this is kind of a stylized drawing of stickleback. Kingfishers are these birds that you see in nature documentaries. They hover over the water, they see a fish, and then they dive into the water to catch it. What happens is that sticklebacks prefer to attack high-density areas of prey, but after a model kingfisher was flown over the tank, they prefer to attack low-density areas. So once again, they adjust their feeding in terms of predation risk. But once again, we see two different types of sticklebacks. 9-spine sticklebacks, you can see all the spines along the back here that are small, not particularly well armored. These guys have much bigger spines and are well armored. These are the guys that will rely on social cues for where to feed. These are the guys that will go around and explore themselves. And this gets into another area of biology that we'll talk about periodically, the idea of personality. You guys know what we mean by personality when we talk about behavior? This is a recent area of research. Joanna Alpert did her work. Her undergraduate thesis was on personality in Florida scrub jays. Do you guys know what I mean when I talk about personality in behavioral research? It's not in your book yet, but like I said, we'll mention it. Personality basically is what we in the 1980s and 90s referred to as inter-individual differences in behavior. And this has been an idea that's a little controversial in behavioral ecology. The idea that two individuals in the same species might behave differently. What Joanna actually studied was neophobia, your fear of new things in your environment. And so what she did for her research is she walked around Central Florida at this place called Archibald Biological Station, and they have a protocol for how they feed these scrub jays. Scrub jays are interesting because they've been researched a lot. They're also interesting because females will raise a rear group of chicks. Those chicks, when they fledge, rather than flying off and starting their own nest, they'll stay with the parents and help raise the next group of chicks. And then those chicks will hatch and those guys will stay around and help raise the next group of chicks. Sometimes the offspring will stick around for 2 to 4 years after they have reached adulthood, when they could go off and reproduce on their own, but they'll stay behind and help their parents rear their siblings. And so they occur in these family groups, which is nice because you can look at family relationships. And at Archibald, they have a standardized protocol whereby they go around and they have feeding stations. And so you walk down the paths that are cut through the sand dunes of Central Florida. And at set points, you basically have feeding stations and you offer them nuts. And at these feeding stations, normally there's just nuts there, and they fly in and they get the nuts because they're used to you as a human. There are pictures of Johanna with like birds perched around on her. That's how accustomed to humans they are. And so they're used to this, going to a place at a certain time of day and getting a food reward. And then her deal was she went to these feeding stations and she just put lots of Lego sculptures around where the food was. And some birds would go to those feeding stations, and when there was something novel there, like a bunch of Lego sculptures around the feeding station, they wouldn't go near that food, and other individuals would just go right up to the food and eat it regardless of what was around it. Those that wouldn't approach food that had novel objects were on the neophobic side of things, and those that would approach food with these novel objects around them were on the non-neophobic side of things. So that's inter-individual behavior within a species. And the opposite of this is sometimes in the literature known as boldness, which is your lack of fear. But you can also think of this as lack of fear of predators or predation risk. And so when we think about these two species, we could think about these two species in terms of their personality, but one of the things about boldness and neophobia is you assume that this individual is bold because it is incurring higher risk. But oftentimes, people look at the behavior, something like approaching a novel object or approaching a predator, and they basically just measure an individual's willingness to do that approach or how close they're willing to get to a particular threat without then assessing anything else about the organism. And this is one of the ways in which people who study this type of area begin to get into trouble, Because it could be that an individual is bold, or it could be that an individual is just fast and can approach a potential predator or something like that more closely, because it has a good sense of how fast it is, has a good sense of how fast a predator might be, and it knows that it can escape that predator because it happens to be fast. Individuals that are slower will approach predators less closely because they need more of a head start to get away from the predator. So these things, these ideas like this are difficult. One, because this is a new set of ideas in behavioral ecology, and two, because people seldom measure anything other than the behavior associated with the boldness or the neophobia or whatever it is. They don't ever actually measure, for example, the physiological capacities of the organisms that they're looking at. This is two different species. They have two different behaviors, rely on social information for foraging decisions versus being bolder and going exploring. But chances are neither of these species are incurring a greater level of risk. These guys have low risk because they allow other individuals to incur risk before they go and make a foraging decision. These individuals probably have relatively low risk simply because they have body armor. And so they're better able to fend off predatory attacks. So as you encounter literature, as you read about animal behavior that deals with personality, keep in mind that you have to think about what the inherent characteristics are of individuals, and in this case of species. These species have different approaches to foraging decision making because of their different morphologies, not because of anything having to do with personality. Social learning in ants. Ants engage in a behavior called tandem running, and what happens is one ant finds a food source, and when it comes back to the colony, it will communicate to its friends that it has found food with the use of pheromones. Pheromone studies like this were pioneered by E.O. Wilson, who, when he was in grad school, dissected out the pheromone glands of ants that are amazingly tiny, located at the tip of the abdomen, found that different glands produce different pheromones, and those pheromones have different functions. But an ant that has found food will communicate with another ant that hasn't been out foraging, that has found food, and then they will engage in what they call tandem running, where the animal that knows where food is will guide the other animal to where that food is, pausing periodically to make sure that the follower is following the trail and can find their way back out. So even in things as simple as insects, there's also teaching in this way. I've already mentioned meerkats eating scorpions, and the process that they go through with doing that. And at this point, we have a little bit of time left, so let's go watch some videos of organisms learning things. Once again, I take no responsibility for commentary on nature documentaries. Oftentimes, the most unfortunate thing about nature documentaries is the commentary.
What's the most interesting fact about meerkats?
Oh my God, I can't go through this thing.
Sunsets, like this one in the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa.
Meerkats don't give a shit about sunsets as far as I know.
After a hard day of hunting. Meerkats grow to a length of 12 inches, weigh about 2 pounds, and are members of the Vadgum. This habit begins at an early age.
So baby meerkats is always a good day when you can watch baby meerkats frolicking.
Interesting. But the most interesting fact about meerkats is what they love.
If you ever go and find this video, there are like 15 most interesting things about meerkats, just so you know.
Eat. These cute little critters love to eat scorpions. They're immune to the venom. First,
I don't know if they're immune to
bites
venom.
off the stinger. Good move. And then it's time to tie on the feed bag. If scorpions are killed,
that's a learned behavior. You see how they're going for the tail first.
But for a meerkat, nothing beats the crunchy goodness of a freshly killed scorpion. And who can argue? Although, well, a little ketchup might help.
So your book describes.
What's the most interesting fact about meerkats?
So your book describes the process by which the adults train the babies to do this. These babies have clearly been trained enough, they know how to go about handling. And like I said, in most cases, scorpions are not fatal, such that you don't need to be immune to the toxin, but they certainly are unpleasant. And once again, if you're a scorpion and you're being attacked by a meerkat, all you need to do is make that meerkat think twice about taking you down to give you enough time to run away. And so there are all sorts of ways in which organisms avoid predation. The next chapter deals with predation risk, and so you should read the next chapter about predator-prey interactions for Wednesday. We're a little bit ahead of schedule now. But in that, it's going to, at the beginning of the chapter, tell you about the predation sequence. There's a sequence of events that happen when predators and prey interact. They happen in an order, and at that point, both predators and prey have adaptations that allow the predators to be successful and allow the prey to escape. And as you go through that sequence, there are things that you can do as a prey item to get away from the predator, one of which is to cause the predator to pause in its attack. And if you can achieve that by stinging it on the nose, then you can perhaps escape. Alarm calls are this way. Have any of you ever heard, speaking of rabbits, Jackson? I don't know much about their mating behavior, but I know what it takes to kill a rabbit. Oh my God, they do scream. What does the scream sound like?
Dying person.
Oh my gosh, it's like a screaming banshee. So I worked at a zoo when I was in graduate school. I worked in the reptile house that also had amphibians, but it was always called the reptile house. And we had these big reticulated pythons, 17, 18 foot long pythons. And they were big such that we fed them like fully adult domestic rabbits.
Ah.
Yeah, like 30-pound rabbits. No, they're big. Have you ever seen like a domesticated rabbit that's like a pet rabbit, a house rabbit? Like,
You
look
just
up.
like fed the snakes these adorable rabbits.
No, we killed them first. You never want to feed in a zoo. You never want to feed an animal live food, typically. And so a rabbit could actually bite the snakes because rabbits have big teeth everywhere. And yes, thank you for that visual, Luke. They have big teeth, and so you don't want to give them a live rabbit. And so the reptile keepers had to go back behind the reptile house and kill the rabbits. And we killed the rabbits in the humane way by cervical dislocation. Have any of you ever attempted to cervically dislocate a rabbit?
That's what I do in my spare time.
It's very hard because they have practically no neck. And so you get a piece of wood, you get it across the back of the rabbit's neck, and you basically pull up on the hind legs. It separates the neck vertebra, paralyzes and kills the rabbit very quickly, very humanely, and then you take these rabbits into the enclosure and you feed these very large snakes, two or three of these things. So the first time that I went to do this, I had never actually killed a rabbit. I'd never actually seen a rabbit as big as these rabbits are. I don't know where they got these rabbits. They ordered them from someplace. But anyway, I go back there and I start the process of killing the rabbit, and this rabbit lets out this blood-curdling scream that is the rabbit's startle response. And of course, the first thing that I do is I let go of the back legs of the rabbit. And so now there's this enclosure behind the reptile house. It's all fenced in solidly. And I'm running around at 10 o'clock in the morning chasing a rabbit down. And the zoo director comes out of the reptile house. He's kind of making his morning rounds. He's like, "What are you doing?" And then he notices the rabbit running around. He's like, "It screamed, didn't it?" Like, yeah. Like, you just have to ignore that and press on. So I spent a good chunk of the morning chasing this rabbit around because it uttered an alarm call that allowed it to escape me for a time period. Luckily, it wasn't just free to go wherever it wanted, and I eventually caught it and fed it to a snake. But anything that causes the predator a moment of pause might give that prey item an opportunity to escape. So it doesn't matter if the venom of a scorpion is like life-threatening or not. If it causes a meerkat enough pain that it causes it to pause, that gives the scorpion an opportunity to get away. And as a result, meerkats get trained by their elders in how to handle scorpions efficiently. Because one of the nice things about scorpions is they have a big body. There's a lot of energy and nutrients in those bodies. And then this is just a video of chimpanzees engaging in termite fishing. Once again, this is a behavior that was noticed in one part of Africa and then was culturally transmitted to other adjacent clans throughout Africa.
Years ago, and Jane Goodall witnessed something that no one had ever seen before. Something that changed the way the world viewed not only chimps, but
It's the first
humans
reported
as
use
well.
of tool using in primates, non-human primates.
The first 6 months' money I had, which was all I had, was running out. And I knew if I didn't see something exciting before that money ran out, that would be the end. And then I saw this black shape hunched over a termite mound. I peered through my binoculars. I saw a hand reach out to pick a piece of grass, and clearly was using this as a tool, pulling it out from the termite that burrows into the nest, and picking the termites off with his lips.
They'll do this with grass
That was what was supposed
and
to make
above
this
ground
monster
termites, and they'll do it with
that's
sticks and below ground
humans
termite
and only
mounds.
humans use and make tools. We were defined as man the tool maker. And so now we have to redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as human.
Termite fishing is only one of 9 chimp tool behaviors witnessed in Gombe. Resident videographer Bill Wallauer sees termite fishing on a regular basis.
Basically, it's like this. Just grab a tool or a twig like this. Strip all the leaves off.
If you've ever dug into a termite mound, as soon as you break it open, they attack whatever is in there. And so it's attacking the grass or stick or whatever, and then they're latched onto it with their pinchers, their mandibles, and then you pull them out and they're just all attached to it because they think it's something dangerous.
Quite good at this, a little bit like cashews.
Anyway, he did say the termites taste like cashews.
Not buying it.
Which if you like cashews, that's a good thing. This concludes economic decisions. We will move forward into predator-prey decisions, or predator-prey interactions on Wednesday. Tomorrow, let's meet at 8:30. It won't take us the whole time to go through the material, assuming that I have your data. And I can get ready for tomorrow throughout the rest of the afternoon. What is left of the rest of the afternoon and tonight, I'll hopefully have data to share with you. Was that what you were gonna ask about lab 12?
On Wednesday, we're doing a lit discussion, I think.
Oh, with Parker and Simmons. Oh, because I guess we're not ahead, we're on time.
We're on
Yes,
time.
okay, I didn't look at the schedule, but yes, Parker and Simmons, if that's scheduled, then that's that. And you need to have a literature summary brought to class that day. Please.
Do you want it like 2 pages or does it matter the length?
Of course it matters to me. Did you look at the specifications?
I did, but it's like
Oh, it doesn't say it, it's always 2 pages, page and a half. Check the syllabus, it's in the syllabus.
Okay.
It's always a page and a half of summary, half page of forward-thinking critical thought. Not, I didn't like the right style. Forward-thinking critical thought. So tomorrow at 8:30, hopefully I'll have data from everybody, we'll go through data tomorrow. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna say, so for the state of the law, you just include it.
No, there's another, look in the
So then,
where are your discounts? Yes. They're on your data sheet, so I just need them, I don't have any access to them without you giving them to me.
well, I didn't see the extra sheet, so it's kind of like.
Okay, yeah,
But these-
yep. Luke, who are you presenting with? Who? And have you guys got together on a plan?
We are not
Tomorrow sometime?
No, we're not tomorrow.
Wait, what? Oh, you're not tomorrow. When are? Oh, so-
We're not for a while.
So
We're
you're
not-
just, you're just.
I just
talking-
wanna just,
You want to talk to me about the summary?
yeah, just, mainly just the paper. Just
Okay,
to try
that's
to
fine.
clear understanding before
Yeah.
I fully start writing.
I gotcha. I was unclear
Yeah.
what the context of wanting to.
Yeah, I don't.
I knew what it's about. Paper, I just
Faster.
didn't know.
If I had a shoe that actually fit my foot, does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, they're Brooks, and I'm surprised my gray and pink ones are 9s too, which I was like, something's wrong. Yeah. Yeah. What? No, Mom, these shoes are too big. Like, I know for sure they're too big. They have those for Brooks. Well, my foot is flat, so my foot in general is wide. Yeah, I wear my arch supports. No, like, I'll send you guys a picture. The shoe is literally just too big at the front, so. Well, I need another pair anyway, so. No, you can order them on Dick's. The reason that I'm having you order them is because for some reason when I try and pull up the Dick's website on my computer, it won't load. Like, it literally just will not load. So.
Get this shit over with.
Well, it won't load on my iPad either, and I don't know why. Yeah, so. I mean, it could have been like the whole Chiefs and thing, but I don't know. I'll, so you want me to try and order them?
You ready for this? Is anyone?
Yeah, I'll send you like exactly what I need. Maybe, but not really.
It was kinda hard because I didn't know what.
Yeah, well, here's the thing, yeah, that's what I'll do, I'll figure it all out tonight, and I'll see like the name and everything. No, that's why I'm gonna send it to you tonight, so you can order it tonight.
So like, you can process, like process these.
I'm about to take another one here pretty soon.
Well,
Yeah.
that's what you should do, go to mile.
Cause I really ended like a B in this class already.
If you don't do
I
the
don't know,
mile,
it's
No.
fine.
then
I gotta get going.
Okay, so is it, do you have a separate lab grade?
No, they combine, it's not like chemistry.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I can do that too, I was just gonna say they're not.
Chem
in
was
the
so
stores
easy
for some
though.
reason.
Keller didn't give it shit.
Okay, lab was easy as fuck. I hated chem.
Very easy.
Yeah,
Who-
okay,
who was
then
it?
I'll just
Keller
look
and
at that
Pierce.
tonight.
I took it twice. I got a C minus the first time. I got
But
a
then,
Who taught it first time?
Keller.
I'll just,
What?
I just like, I'm not a very, I can't, when someone's just talking off of like what they saw, like what's on the board, I don't learn. So like, I need to have a good conversation about something.
See, I just read the book. I didn't ever listen to the class anyways. Like I do in here, I just play on my phone.
I'm
read the
just
book.
not good at chemistry. I got a
But-
C plus last semester. This semester I'm getting it, I have a tutor I got a B on my test, so I got like A's.
Ooh.
But it just sucks in this class right now because he doesn't. I'd rather read a book and learn than listen and
Yes,
talk.
that's why I'm excited, okay, we don't have any like actual textbook questions due for like a little bit, right?
not right now.
Like, it's all on the syllabus, like what we're supposed to be doing for the schedule, but I'm like, okay, what page numbers, what questions? Sorry, and then we also have something due on Friday, it's like a chapter quiz thing.
Dr. Benz brought his dog and his sons to class today, and his dog pooped on the floor.
Oh.
And then we opened the window and the dog ran up and like got up on the window. We're like, oh my God, we're really crazy. Jumped out the third floor of Jewel Hall. Like, it was, I hit the Jack Russell. It was really cute and he was really sweet. And he was like throwing the ball out of the classroom as I was running after. But yeah, then he pooped on the floor.
Oh, I'm a co-parent with like my friends Mario, Doug, and Jared. And literally I would die
What's
with
his
this dog.
new name now?
Are you talking about the husky or are you talking about dog? They keep calling it Rogue. Husky,
the Husky.
the Husky found its owner.
They did?
They found him.
And they took it back to Raytown, I thought that person said they didn't want it.
So they found like the third, or like it's been like dropped
They
around.
sold it on Craigslist, the people who originally put the ID chip in it, and they were from Raytown, they said they didn't want it
Yeah.
anymore.
I hate people. Also, why is there an iPad out there?
Polinsky videos in his classes.
Sick. You leave it
I
in here.
think Polinsky left his iPhone.
Let's sell it on the internet and split the profit.
A whole $10 to all of us.
What are you talking about? He's something like $400.
Those things are like $100.
No, that's a brand new iPad.